acute these concerns are. You got parents and grandparents feeling demoralized that they don't know that their kids or grandkids would ever be able to live in those communities that produce them. And yet, we're also at a moment when the cost competitiveness of some of our biggest cities in the country is collapsing. I often get a laugh just by describing to audiences in the Bay Area what it costs to get a nice house in Indiana. It tells me that the terms for a better way of life in the middle of the country are there, if we establish the kind of quality of place that enables people to live well. Remember, the economy is evolving in a direction where physical connectedness to a specific spot is actually growing less important than it used to be. Telecommuting, the nature of different kinds of jobs won't change everything for everybody, but it changes a lot. And it creates, I think, a golden moment for repopulation of many of our areas that have depopulated. But that means you have to believe that the basics of being able to live well are taken care of. That means infrastructure. That means internet access. It means healthcare. And at a time when rural hospitals are closing at an alarming and accelerating rate, it threatens to become a snowball effect because then people have one more reason to hesitate to live in a rural area. This, though, can be addressed through policy, whether we're talking about updating the formulas for reimbursements to incentivize rural care, or helping to recruit and cultivate a next generation of people to work in the healthcare field in less populated areas. There are things we can do. The bottom line is we've got to invest in the competitiveness and well-being of all of our communities. And then there's a lot of opportunity for growth. Of course, the other thing we have to recognize is that immigration is a big part of this story. We did the 4th of July parade in Storm Lake and saw some of the growth and vibrancy that is happening there. Think again about my own city, where we have fought so hard to have population growth, and it's finally happening. If you netted out immigration, it'd be zero. And so we got to recognize that this is also part of the answer and part of the solution for, I think, a lot of communities that maybe have been taught to fear those who are newer Americans, but can be reminded that that's part of how these communities emerged in the first place.
It appears to me that most of your talk about immigration kind of reflects the Democratic field as far as comprehensive reform, some sort of pathway to citizenship. We have seen from the statistics, though, that there has indeed been a surge at the border as far as apprehension of migrants, especially in May, kind of then leveled back off in June. But if you were president today, how would you address that?
Well, where we are right now is a humanitarian crisis at the border. There is an increase, an influx even. It's not unprecedented, but the squalor of the conditions is unprecedented. So how do we square that? How do we explain that America has seen these levels of arrivals before, but we have never witnessed the kinds of horrors that we're seeing right now in terms of the conditions that people are being kept in? I believe the reason is a combination of politics and incompetence. The incompetence is that any halfway decent incident management structure would be able to safely and humanely accommodate the levels of people we're seeing at the border. The politics is, frankly, I believe this administration needs this crisis to grow worse for political reasons. There's a reason why they send the VP in to have a day of news coverage of him looking at horrible conditions in which men, for some reason the one he visits that they invite the cameras to is only men, are being kept. And it's that it arouses this sense of crisis and this sense of fear that empowers the current president's political agenda. Now, there is a legitimate concern, of course, about more and more people often fleeing for their lives arriving at our border. If we're serious about dealing with that, then in addition to comprehensive immigration reform, which, as you said, I think most of us in the party have approximately the same views on, we also got to look at the push conditions that are driving people to do it. The best answer for everybody is for people to be able to thrive and prosper wherever they are. It's one of the reasons why it was completely self-defeating to talk about withdrawing U.S. aid to Central American countries. And once again, it's a reason why climate is at our doorstep, because there's a lot of evidence that climate-related scarcity is part of what is motivating migration, and that's only going to increase in the coming years. So we got to deal with root causes for the long term. But in the short term, taking steps like moving housing and detention out of CBP and into health and human services, and reestablishing things like the family case management program for asylum seekers, which virtually everybody participating in showed up as expected for their hearings, would help a lot while we're tackling these longer term issues.
How do we change the conversation about immigration, though? Because we've seen lately, frankly, the immigration at our southern border characterized as people coming to this country who want to rape and pillage Americans. Right. I mean, how do you change that conversation now that is the tone?
Well, two things need to happen.
There's a lot of reception for that
Sure.
point of view.
I mean, again, part of what would help would be to actually fix the issue. Right? So the president got elected saying he was going to fix it. Obviously, it's gotten much worse on his watch by inaction and, in my view, by cruelty. So part of it's just actually resolving this in a way we haven't done since the 80s with an actual package of reforms that, by the way, most Americans, there's a big enough overlapping consensus on what we ought to do. That if a White House were driving it, no matter the makeup of Congress, it should be doable. But
we haven't done it yet. I mean, it's
that's
been
right.
tried since the second Bush administration, at least.
Right. Yeah, and it was always this issue that was kind of important but never rose to number one. Right. Now I think everybody in both parties understands, if for different reasons, why it needs action right away. So the deeper question, I think, is one of the atmosphere around this debate. I think that's kind of what you're getting to. And I think the biggest concern to me is the dehumanization that's going on. What changes things in my experience is for people to regard other people as people. We have a case, I wrote about it in my book, in South Bend, where a popular small business owner was deported to Mexico. He had been trying to get his green card sorted out. He went to ICE every year, and this time, when he went to his ICE checkup, he didn't come back out. The people who came to me demanding that I do something, which of course as a mayor I couldn't, to stop his deportation, were all very conservative Republicans, just because of the part of town he lived in. His wife voted for Donald Trump. And their expectation was that, yeah, he's going to get rid of the bad people, but not somebody like Roberto. We love Roberto. When we're talking about actual human beings who we can picture, it changes everything versus talking about stock characters or categories, where we are always worse toward abstractions. And it's going to be our job in the Democratic Party, I think, to illustrate the humanity of the experience of seeking a better life in this country, while also reassuring Americans that we're also committed to the territorial integrity of the United States. Look, he's going to say we're for open borders no matter what we do. But most Americans are not for closed borders. And at some point we have to decide how we're going to manage the flow of people in and out of this country. Our country can handle it if we have the right structures. And right now we obviously don't. We got a White House that could take credit for a big achievement if they saw immigration reform through, but would rather have a crisis unsolved than an achievement to brag about.
You rolled out a labor plan yesterday and talked a lot about expanding and reinforcing the right to unionize for gig workers, for temp workers, that sort of thing. You also called for an end to right-to-work laws. Iowa, of course, is a right-to-work state. Why shouldn't a right to unionize be balanced by a right not to participate?
Well, what we've seen is that right to work is part of a bigger agenda to break down the ability to unionize. And what I've proposed is a comprehensive framework that establishes fairness in union elections and more access to the opportunity to unionize for those who have been written out of it, whether it's gig workers who've been written out of it because nobody thought of that when they started the NLRA, or farm workers and domestic workers who were written out of it for reasons that I think today we have to admit were at least partly racial. And what we've seen in terms of right to work is we can philosophize about it, but if you just look at its actual effects on the ground, the actual pragmatic consequences of doing it, what tends to happen is your state starts looking better in magazine surveys of CEOs, and it starts looking worse in terms of indices of quality of life, well-being, health, and earnings. So we've seen what these laws do. They make people worse off, and it's why I think we got to move in a different direction.
But those are state laws.
That's right.
As president, how are you going to change it?
So I think federal leadership, and you can see this in the texts of a lot of legislation, much of which, by the way, I didn't generate. So we proposed the things that I want to add to the conversation. There's also a lot of things from the PRO Act to the Public Service Right to Negotiation Act that use federal mechanisms to at least encourage better outcomes at the state level. But it starts with having a White House and a U.S. Department of Labor and an NLRB that are actually interested in enforcing these things. And I don't think we have that today. For all the president's talk about being for the forgotten American worker, it's almost like he wants American workers to think their biggest problem is political correctness, and I think their biggest problem is they're not making enough money.
So are you walking the talk as far as unionization? Are you negotiating with your campaign workers as far as a union? Are you paying every campaign worker, even the temps and part-timers, $15 an hour?
Yep, we're paying our interns. We're putting our money where our mouth is. And obviously as management, I can't tell them to unionize, but we've made clear that if they decide to, we will welcome that.
How about in South Bend? Does every single city worker make at least $15 an hour?
So we've boosted the minimum wage from where it was. It was in the 7s and 8s, and a few years ago there was a push. At the time, the talk was about getting to 10.10. I think because in inflation-adjusted terms, that would have corresponded to what it was in the 60s when many of these initiatives began. And so we undertook that and accelerated it to get to 10.10. Now we're looking at how we can boost it, and I think we'd very much be on track to get to 15 by the time the legislation that I have favored that just passed the House would have it take place, which I think is 2025 or 6, depending on what they bargain. Obviously, it's a bit of an academic exercise while the Senate's waiting to kill it. But we would absolutely be tracking toward that in South Bend.
You've sort of been famous for trying to measure everything in South Bend, putting a lot of analysis and metrics to your decision making. A lot of measures look better in the economy for South Bend after your 2 terms as mayor. But the poverty level in South Bend is still somewhat above Indiana and also nationally. Why haven't you been able to move the needle more on that?
Well, we're talking about some of the most intractable problems facing American industrial cities, but we have seen the poverty rate move substantially. I mean, to the tunes of thousands of jobs being created and more than 1,000 people being lifted out of poverty in a short amount of time. So we're still one of the lowest income cities in the state, no question. It took about 50 years to get here. But I would say that the progress we've made in my 8 years is extraordinary in that regard, especially for a city that was written off as near collapse. It's going to take a generation to fully overcome poverty in our community. But having arrived with it closer to 30% than not, and having driven it under 25 and still making progress, I think we've seen that we can empower people to live better in our community. Now, that being said, as long as we're living in a state and in a country that does not equip people with the basics to be able to live well, there are limits to how much a community, even the best community, can deliver on its own. And it's one of the things motivating me to seek change at the national level.
So how much of West Bend's problems are the decline of manufacturing and those union jobs?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, it all started in '63 when Studebaker fell apart. And overnight, tens of thousands of jobs, direct and indirect, basically vanished. And that led to the spiral of vacant and abandoned houses in our neighborhoods, vacant factories, some of which still taunt me on our skyline, although we've been able to replace, rehabilitate, and remove many of them. But this is something we're still living with. And the reality is, even as manufacturing output increases, it's never going to be as labor intensive as it used to be. I mean, even if we were making the same number of Studebakers as we did in the 60s, we'd probably be doing it with 10% as many workers. which is why even as we continue to drive success in manufacturing, and there are areas where we're very good at it because we can do advanced manufacturing better than anybody, we also got to acknowledge that we're going to have to find more ways to create more jobs because of the relationship between worker and machine. And that's something that's only going to accelerate in our time.
So is it kind of a false promise then for politicians at the national level to promise we're going to bring back manufacturing to this country like we had it in the 60s?
It's definitely not going back to the 60s. And that was the message, that was the difficult truth that I had to carry even in my first campaign for mayor. Because even then, I mean, 50 years on, a lot of the folks would say, if only we could get some version of Studebaker back. And I had to say, that's not coming back, but we are, and here's how. Some of it is manufacturing, but it's not 20,000 people at one shop. I'd rather have 20,000 people employed 100 at a time across 200 different employers. That way, if we lose some of them, we can absorb it. But it's also, we're creating jobs in industries that didn't exist when the last Studebaker rolled off the line. On the very acreage where the Studebaker factory stood, we got data centers cropping up because we got cold weather, cheap power, and really good fiber. And creating a whole different...
Very few people working in that.
Yes, but the jobs it generates pay well. But again, yeah, like advanced manufacturing, there's fewer people per dollar of output. I was at a very typical company in our region. They make shot peen medium. These little balls you kind of blast at auto parts to temper them. They do about $7 million a year, and they got 7 workers. So $1 million per person, right, is the kind of output that you expect now. But we also find that we can generate enough new economy and old economy jobs and newly invented jobs like gig economy jobs that would be great for everybody if there was some level of protection that you knew that you would make a good wage there. And you didn't rely on them for things like your ability to have health care, or for that matter, sick leave. So the way our sick leave plan is set up is if I'm driving 7 hours a week for Uber, 7 divided by 40 is how much that ought to go into my sick leave. So it's not just about portable benefits. It's more and more we got to have benefits that are portable, but also prorated, so that if you are stringing together 2 or 3 jobs, which I think you shouldn't have to, but this is the world we're in, there's no magic between working 40 hours a week and working 20.
You're going through a tough time with race relations right now in South Bend. Kind of started out rocky as mayor with the firing of the first police chief in South Bend's history over some taping that you said caused lack of trust. And then, of course, the shooting of a black man by who allegedly had a knife by a white officer whose camera wasn't on. If we could rewind the clock a little bit, with the benefit of hindsight, what would you have done differently to improve race relations in South Bend?
Well, looking back, there are a lot of things, especially around the communication of the first crisis when we had the FBI investigation into the first chief, that I could have done differently, and learned a lot of things the hard way. There are lessons we've put to work since. At the same time, some of these issues are sensitive, not only because of the individual incidents that you're managing on the ground, but because of everything that goes behind them. So, the way that we're, as a community, working through the anguish around the shooting of Eric Logan is a good example. In many ways, the pain and the problems behind that are the same, no matter what the independent prosecutor tells us about what happened with the knife and the moment that took place. We're still waiting on that to come back. But we know that incident would not have triggered such an outpouring of anguish if it weren't for the fact that black residents feel like they're living in a different country, that they have felt and been excluded in terms of economic well-being and in terms of health and all the different forms of empowerment that make you an equal citizen. It's part of what we're trying to speak to with the Douglas Plan, because we're encountering the limits of what you can manage to do as an urban mayor, so long as an entire class of Americans is systematically dispossessed in a pattern that's gone back for 100 years, but also is a consequence of decisions and policies that happen within living memory. It is too much to ask a neighborhood or a community to solve these things when we failed to act in a coordinated, intentional, national fashion to do something about it. Now, in terms of relationships at home, if the standard is, did we end racial disparities, or have we ended mistrust between law enforcement and the black community? The answer, of course, is no. But part of how we've been able to earn support, not from everybody, but a lot of support among diverse constituencies locally. It's the support that got me reelected. It's the support on display when we had the African American Supporters for Pete event a few days ago in South Bend, is that we are finding ways to empower residents to handle these to the extent they can be handled locally. So opening up our use of force policy to make sure that everybody has a chance to weigh in, and that there's a transparent process for amending it if there's a way to make it better. Making sure that the process for nominating people to the Board of Safety that actually decides on hiring and firing of officers under Indiana law in our city reflects community input. And that there's a higher bar, as there is dramatically higher bar from when I came in, on the expectations and accountability for officers, especially officers called up on disciplinary charges for wrongdoing. Meanwhile, we got to have a very difficult conversation with the police union, who felt when I spoke to police officers about the shadow of systemic racism that I was accusing each of them of effectively being bad people. And they need to see a way to be part of the solution here too. These are some of the most intractable and toughest issues in American society today. And the premise here is not that I rolled up in 2012 and now they're solved. The premise is that I don't deal with these issues from the standpoint of somebody debating them in a committee room or on cable. I deal with them as somebody who holds in my heart the identity of a community, and therefore feels all the ways in which it gets torn up by these forces that are not cosmic forces, they're human forces, and they require that we do something about them. And we need a president who gets that, who's lived it, who's learned these things, often the hard way, and knows how to support communities trying to do the right thing.
There is no national database of officer-involved shooting. I've seen you call for one. On the other hand, I've seen you talk about like incentives for localities and states to gather more data about police and interactions with the public. If it's not required, if it's just incentives, won't we just end up with the patchwork we have now?
Yeah, I do think we need to have a national standard. And we're getting there on crime reporting with the move to the NIBRS reporting standard. And we were on that track with the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report tool that the FBI maintained. I think we have to have something similar for use of force incidents. So we tried to model this at home. I don't know of a lot of other cities our size, certainly in the Midwest, that have managed to produce an incident level data readout. We've been doing this for a few years now. Of use of force incidents, and publish the rate at which they're happening, bless you, so people can see how that number has tracked downward in a city where officers do 100,000 calls a year, roughly. But it shouldn't be up to us to think this up. We shouldn't have to invent our own data standard. So at the very least, I think the government ought to be producing the standard that all of us can work toward. For example, we need to now go to the next step on ours and start coding them by race, which we've not been doing yet. And so that's one refinement we know we can make. But there ought to be a national standard. And then we can establish a national audit process to determine whether the reporting is actually accurate. And that's where I think we really start seeing which are the communities that do the best job of this and which are the communities that need extra attention. Of course, it helps if you have a DOJ that actually cares about these things. So the difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration in terms of having resources to move policing into the 21st century, I mean, the difference has been complete. I mean, it's from having a lot of support and a lot of interest to very little evidence that they care.
You, several months ago, called for a commission to study proposing reparations for Black Americans. Sometimes calling for a commission is the equivalent of a politician saying, I don't personally want to be tied to this, and you end up with a report on a shelf. Have you given more thought personally to how you think that should be shaped?
Well, the idea of the commission is what's encoded in H.R. 40, the House legislation sponsored by Sheila Jackson Lee and others. And I believe the value of it is it starts helping people get their heads around an idea that I think for many Americans seems impractical because it's not been looked at very rigorously. But part of what we're doing with the Douglas Plan is demonstrating policies that would be reparative or restorative without having to wait for a commission like that to come back. Because I think both of these things need to happen. What the commission can do is really open our imagination, I think, philosophically, to how we could, with some measure of fairness, fix something that was broken on purpose by the United States of America with implications for people living today. But we also know that there are things that we can and should do around housing, education, employment, health, criminal justice, democracy itself, that shouldn't have to wait for that. And that's why we went forward with the very specific things in the Douglas Plan, even as we support the move that's going on in Congress toward creating that commission.
So the Douglas Plan, there are parts of it like dramatically increasing Title I funding for low-income schools that would help everyone. It's not necessarily race-based. Other parts of it are specifically race-based, like calling for federal contracts to go to 25% minority-owned businesses.
Right.
What would you say to white Americans who in the past 40 years have seen their own wages stagnate, and feel that their own economic prospects have stagnated as well, for them not to say, perhaps have hard feelings about another group being helped specifically?
Well, low-income white Americans have a lot to gain from what I'm proposing, whether it's things around Title I or minimum wage or the labor rights that I'm trying to extend to all. There is a separate and very important problem we've got to deal with, which is that we live in a country where some of the people who live here used to own some of the other people who used to live here. And where, again, within living memory, as a matter of policy, Black Americans have been excluded from housing, educational benefits, both de facto and in the letter of the law in many ways. And these problems don't go away on their own. Even when you replace a racist policy with a neutral one, these things don't go away on their own, they compound. The example I always give is compound interest. So if the overall interest rate's 5%, right? We know that if I save $1 today, next year it's $1.05. In I think 14 years it becomes $2. In 100 years or less it becomes $100. In 150 years, that $1 at 5% becomes $1,000. If that's true for $1 saved, then it's true for $1 stolen. How much more than $1 per person was stolen from Black Americans as of 150 years ago? And who thinks that a Black American today who is descended from slaves is not worse off because of that? In other words, the fact that some of these harms happened a long time ago doesn't make it better. It makes it worse. Also, countries with extreme inequality tend to be worse off for everybody. In other words, you take two countries that have the same average income. The more unequal one tends to have a shorter life expectancy, more crime, worse public health. There's no bigger driver of inequality in our country than racial inequality. It's not the only inequality, but it sure is powerful. And while there are different ways that different classes of Americans have been harmed, there's only two classes of Americans, Black Americans and Native Americans, who were systematically, officially, legally made not citizens for the bulk of the time span of the American experiment. And it's just not going to get better on its own.
Isn't reparations just basically another version of the affirmative action debate that ripped this country apart for a long time?
In a way.
Divided even blacks and whites. The wisdom of doing it.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges around doing this, especially when people feel like something's being taken from them. But to me, the bigger source of division is racial hostility. Things that we thought maybe as a country, naively, we were well on our way to doing away with. I met a group of kids in LA the other day that I'm still thinking about. They're 13, 14, 15 years old. They're into coding, and there was a nonprofit that gave them a chance to travel to California and visit Netflix and Google and these places. And they were at this, just by chance, they were touring this startup incubator, this co-working space for minority businesses that I was at in Los Angeles. And I got to talking with them. And 3 of the 4 kids who asked questions asked some version of how they're supposed to deal with racial harassment going on in their schools. They're high school kids, middle school kids, dealing with this now. And I think that polite opinion in white America is very much behind the reality of what people are putting up with right now in this country. And it will reach a boiling point. I can feel it in moments like South Bend, where maybe I'm trying to explain something about policing to folks who don't want to hear it because they don't trust anything that anybody says to them anymore. Even when we're doing the right thing. That could blow this country up. In the history of the American project, once have we actually come close to the American project ending, and it was the Civil War. White supremacy is the force that has come closest to bringing this country to its knees. And I believe that lurking danger is still with us. It's been brought to the surface a little more than usual under this presidency, but it's always been there. And if we don't tackle it, even with some challenging conversations about what we all owe each other as Americans, it's just going to keep secreting this poison into American life.
As you talk about reparations or the compounding interest of the pain of slavery, you mentioned briefly Native Americans, and so wouldn't that have more compounding interest because the people who came here after the Native Americans were already here were longer ago than slavery? And how would you right the ship there?
Well, again, I think that there's a very simple way of knowing when we've gotten there. And it's when race is no longer a predictor, at least if you control for other things, of how you're doing in life. So if you're black, even if you control for everything else that's different or could affect things, you have worse health outcomes, worse experience with criminal justice, worse ability to build wealth. Same is true for as a result of different patterns of exclusion. The same thing is true for Native Americans. And we need a set of policies to deal with that too. We have some. I mean, it's what we're doing with the whole idea of land and trust. It's what reservations is supposed to do, although obviously life on the res is such that you can't really say that's been restorative. And so it's kind of a separate category of policies that we're developing, but it does raise a parallel set of questions.
And so when you say we're developing, should we expect your campaign to have a Native American?
Yeah, you'll hear more from us on policy for Native Americans for sure. It's a little different in that here what we're really talking about is how the framework of tribal sovereignty can be aligned with an American effort to deal with those inequalities. But it's very urgent.
Can you talk about your trade policy?
Yeah. So I'm from a part of the country that got told a lot of things about trade. Basically the message was, do what we say. The pie will get so much bigger that everybody will get a bigger slice. And even if you're made worse off in the short run, you're going to be way better off in the long run. And it didn't happen. I mean, the pie got bigger, but people didn't get a bigger slice, which is why there's a level of real anger about anything related to trade. I'm not a closed markets, anti-trade kind of guy. I just want to see it be set up in a way that's fair and that actually benefits American workers. And too often I think we've been asked to accept trade deals that don't do that. Now, right now we have a trade, I don't even know if you can call it a strategy, but we have a pattern of behavior by this president relating to trade that also harms American workers and farmers. You look at what's happening to soy farmers with these tariffs. You look at what's happening to American consumers, whether people realize it or not. The best estimates I've seen put it at about a $830 per household, I think, that we will be paying more as a consequence of the China trade war alone in the prices of our goods. Tariffs are taxes, and we need to think carefully before raising taxes on Americans in the name of trade, or in the name of trade policy.
But isn't that what President Trump was out to do with his China approach, was to make trade fair for Americans?
But
He felt China was basically taking advantage of this country.
Yeah, except he shot Americans in the foot in order to do it.
So how would you deal with trying to make it?
Well, look, the reality is China's entire economic structure relies on state action and a number of things they do that we don't like. They're not going to change the fundamentals of their economy because we're poking them in the eye with tariffs. And we can see this because they haven't. It hurts both parties and not much changes. So if we really want to be smart with China, we're going to have to first of all, invest in our own competitiveness so that we're a step ahead. And also invest in international institutions that would actually hold them to account when they are manipulating the system. So that part's not wrong. I mean, I agree that probably more than most Democrats, I believe that China presents a major challenge and we need to stand up to them. It's just that if you're going to do that, I mean, China notoriously plans in 10, 20, 30-year increments. There's no evidence of there being a plan at all in the American strategy. And our plan has to be one that balances the fundamental competitive dynamics where we just got to invest in our own health, education, infrastructure, and so on. The power dynamics that have them investing hard money and making friends around the world in areas where we're retreating. That's what things like the Belt and Road Initiative do. And making sure that we recognize the real need to, in some ways, have an orderly decoupling of some of the dependence we've created, 5G being a good example, that aren't really in the American interest, so long as China mixes its economy and its state in the way that they do.
Would you return the United States to the TPP?
Not in its current format, but I do believe we need to be ahead of China in setting the economic frameworks for the Pacific Rim, because if not, they're obviously going to do it for us and we'll be competing on their terms rather than ours.
You said that you would support targeted military action in Syria. What would that look like?
Well, what it wouldn't look like would be an open-ended commitment to send in troops. There are cases where there may need to be, for example, an airstrike to deal with a terrorist situation that could materialize into a threat against the homeland. But when we're talking about any use of military force that can be avoided, or that is anything but an extremely rare and extremely urgent situation, Congress needs to be involved. And the untold story of our endless wars is that Congress has really kind of pushed off its responsibility. It's the reason I believe that any authorization for the use of military force ought to have a 3-year sunset built into it, so that if you do get into one of these situations and the president believes we need to stay there, the president ought to have to go back to Congress and justify it. Right now, we got troops in not just Afghanistan, but parts of Africa, based on a authorization that's about a page long, passed to deal with 9/11. We're fighting groups that are enemies of Al-Qaeda based on an authorization to deal with Al-Qaeda. And it's because Congress doesn't want to deal with it either. Until we deal with that, we're going to continue to have a lot of ambiguity around the standards for the use of force and around how we'll ever extricate ourselves from some of the conflicts we're in.
What are your personal sort of tripwires for saying, yes, this requires sending troops into harm's way?
Response to a direct attack against the homeland. Response or prevention of an imminent attack against U.S. interests or allies. Or, if and only if in the context of an internationally legitimate coalition, response to atrocities. But in each of those, it would also have to be the case that there is no viable alternative. And I say this as somebody, when I left Afghanistan, I thought I was one of the very last troops turning out the lights. Years have gone by, we're still there. And it's a reminder that the best way to deal with wars that are hard to get out of is not to get into one. That's why we're so concerned about what's happening in Iran. And the possibility that what's happening in Iran amounts to a dynamic that could even get away from the president himself.
What would you do in that particular situation?
Well, the Iranians have signaled that the sanctions are creating enough pain that if there were a face-saving way to get to the table, they would probably embrace it. There's some complicated internal politics going on from the Revolutionary Guard Corps to the moderates to now Ahmadinejad deciding to kind of come back on the scene in a peculiar way. But the bottom line is, if we can structure the right kind of incremental trust-building measures, it will probably be less, not more, comprehensive than the JCPOA, which itself was very limited because it dealt with the nuclear stuff and it didn't touch the malign activities of support for Hezbollah, any of the regional activities going on. But I believe that they would come to the table for some kind of incremental trust-building measure that would lead to some kind of mitigation of the sanctions. And in doing so, it's not that it would solve much right away. It's just everything depends on the trend line. Are we going this way or are we going that way? Because if we're going this way, it's going to go up and up and up. It seems to be where we are now. And if we just tilt it to a just ever so slightly negative number on the temperature, then we have something that we can build on.
Is there a final question from the rest of the table? If
You've outlined some plans to remake the U.S. Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Could you address some of the criticism, including from some sitting justices, that tampering with that system might make Americans' relationship and trust of that institution more toxic?
So the whole idea here is to make the court less politicized. I think a lot of people object to what they view as court packing. So do I. The point is not to just throw more people on there because the court's too conservative and it ought to be more liberal, even though I think it is too conservative. The point is to deal with the fact that it's coming to be regarded as a nakedly political institution. And so what I favor, and this is another case where I'd impanel a commission, but I think the commission's really important because you ought to have constitutional scholars debating this, not just people like me. But the point is to create a menu of options that would change the political profile of the court. I'm interested in one that does entail more justices on the bench, where you have 15, but only 10 are chosen through the traditional partisan political mechanism, the other 5 by a unanimous agreement of the other 10. And the idea is that by necessity, it gets you justices who think for themselves. I think the article is coming out this summer in the Yale Law Journal that furnishes some of the legal theory behind this. There's a controversy among scholars over whether it could be done by statute or whether it would call for an amendment. But some very practiced minds have evaluated this possibility. On the other end of the boldness spectrum is probably term limits. They're attractive, but they create some problems of their own. A solution kind of in between those poles.
Not to mention the Constitution.
Yeah. And again, there are interesting debates over how much of this is statutory versus constitutional, right? There's an idea of rotating justices from the appellate bench, having them come on and off. It would reduce this kind of apocalyptic firefight that happens every time there's a vacancy. But it goes to a bigger question, which is I think that we've gotten so used to things that are just encrusted that we assume that they're cosmically permanent. At the beginning of this century, the United States had a different number of states than it does today. During my mother's lifetime, actually, the United States had a different number of states. At the beginning of this century, we had a different number of representatives in the House of Representatives. And I believe the number of justices on the court has changed approximately 6 times in American history. I would argue it was changed a couple years ago by Senate Republicans who changed it to 8 and then changed it back when they took power. So we can't be afraid, and as a result of us losing our imagination around reform, even though as recently as the 60s and 70s, constitutional amendments took place, ones that didn't make it like the ERA, ones that did like the 25th and the changing the voting age. We just over the last 40 or 50 years somehow lost our awareness that structural reforms are an option. And I think it's one reason why our system has become incapable of meeting some of the problems of the moment. I don't say these things carelessly or lightly. I don't think some of them could be achieved in less than a generation, but that's all the more reason to start right away. At least open the debate, push the envelope. Because these institutions are, in so many respects, letting us down. And one of the most elegant qualities of the Constitution is it's designed for renewal and self-healing. And we shouldn't be afraid. This country changed its Constitution so you couldn't drink, and then changed its mind and changed it back. And here we have this moment where it's just very clear that the machineries of government have gotten gummed up to where they're not working for us anymore, to where 80 or 90% of Americans want certain outcomes and Congress won't do it.
Well, at the risk of dragging us out longer, that's kind of, isn't that why we're here? Because Congress can't act or won't act, and so everybody's looking to the courts to solve all of our problems.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, isn't that kind of at the root of it?
Yes, although I think given the remaking of the judiciary, what could happen 3 or 4 years from now is Congress will become radically more responsive to the American people and the courts will block it all. Right? So look, there's always going to be this kind of balance among the branches. It's part of how the system was set up. I'm just saying that the country has been at its best when it's revises. There are certain things we tolerate that are absolutely indefensible in principle. I'm not just talking about like things we argue over as Democrats and Republicans. There is no earthly reason why a McDonald's worker in Washington, D.C. Should not have a senator and I should. There's no good reason. She's got just as many problems as I do or more. There's no philosophical defense for why she lacks a senator. But we just put up with it because it was always done that way. And the phrase that I banned the moment I got in the county city building in South Bend was, we've always done it this way. If there's a reason why we've always done it this way, fine, let's have that debate. But now's a good season for America to check on all these things that we've always done this way and ask if we ought to keep doing it that way. And so whether it's the Supreme Court or any number of other areas where it feels like we've just ground down to where nothing's working, we have to at least elevate our ambition and our imagination as a country to take these on. Because, you know, God willing, I'm going to live to see how some of this stuff worked out and have to explain to my kids whether in 2020 we decided to continue operating based on the assumptions that served America well in 1960, or whether we actually got with the times before it was too late.
We'll give you one more minute. Any final thoughts or questions we should have asked but didn't?
Ooh. Well, we covered a lot of ground there. That was pretty good. So I don't want to open a whole new path for us other than to say that I hope I've conveyed my sense of urgency about where we are right now. And that is a sense of urgency for the country, but is also something with political implications, because we're also at one of those moments where I think the country needs bolder and more original answers. And if we're not offering that up as a party, I think that's how we lose. So I'm obviously a little different than my competitors. And what I'm trying to put forward is a mixture of experience and vision that starts to point a way toward how we get out of this before it's too late. I still think we're underreacting as a country to the situation that we're in. Countries hit moments like this and things either get better or they go off a cliff. We're at one of those moments. It's why I tell audiences that we are living on a blank page between chapters in American history, and that's why everything's so hard to read. And the decisions we make right now are going to decide what the balance of this century is going to look like. And I'm here to make the case that we got to think bigger than we have.
Thank you, Mayor.